If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, we shall review Charnel Houses of Europe, the Shoah, a sourcebook for Wraith the Oblivion. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the sourcebook for you. The folks at White Wolf Publishing, Onyx Path and World of Darkness HQ have always attempted to be diverse in their viewpoints and cultural influences, which is something I've always applauded. It is one of the more interesting things about the World of Darkness as a game setting, especially when you consider how different and new this was during the 90s and early noughties. I should, however, stress that the key word in my opening statement is try, because most of those attempts were varying levels of cringe, racist and just overall really bad. It is such an opinion and objective fact that may make the novice World of Darkness fan physically flinch when I part with you that on the 15th of April 1997, White Wolf released a sourcebook for Wraith the Oblivion that focused on the Holocaust. Understandably, this was developed under the Black Dog Game Factory Aegis books within the World of Darkness line, a rating that was meant for mature audiences. Yes, World of Darkness games have always been advertised for adult gamers, but books with this particular rating were often more graphic and horrific in their writing and presentation. For a while, I believed what certain European World of Darkness friends were saying about it, but I would hear a largely positive reception of this book when I released my review on the last World War themed book, Wraith the Great War, so I was a bit curious. So I saved up my oboli and received my copy on the 9th of January 2023 and will give you my verdict on whether this book is a hot mess or you should grab it like it was hot off the press. But before I do that, here are the rules for the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they're conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. And if I wasn't clear enough, this is obviously going to be touching on some really heavy themes, so regarding the Holocaust and the Nazis, so if that is triggering for you, I understand totally if you want to sit this one out. If, however, you are a Holocaust denier or someone who agrees with Nazi ideology, I hope you die a slow and horrible death, preferably by your own fucking filthy hands. As with my previous book reviews, I will start at the very beginning, which is the physical book itself, which currently sits nicely upon my lap. Unlike most of the books I have reviewed, this one is a soft cover rather than a hard copy, so I can't copy and paste the same part of my previous scripts this time. I also won't be mentioning how it follows the usual Wraith chain design, as that is replaced by a dark, barbed wire motif which I hope doesn't need further extrapolation. In the centre is a scroll or some form of tablet with Hebrew iconography and or scriptures. I am not Jewish, so I cannot speak of its meaning, but the intention is very clear, especially with the illuminated fire-like effect. To extrapolate, Shoah is Hebrew for catastrophe. This term specifically means the killing of nearly 6 million Jews in Europe by Nazi Germany and its collaborators during the Second World War. English-speaking countries more commonly use the word Holocaust, which is Greek for sacrifice by fire. The back cover follows similar motifs, mainly with the golden text that makes up the title with the centre of the space of the letters O filled and occupied by a tiny star, or Shield of David, and the barbed wire background that wraps around from the front. Unlike the front cover, artwork found within the book occupies the centre of the back cover. Hundreds of Yiddish wraiths waiting on an aisle, watching a figure that is either a ferryman or some other equivalent sail away on a plank of wood. It is a very harrowing sight, the desolation of the landscape and the hundreds of wraiths whose deaths were slow, horrific and indescribably evil. Most notable of all, none of it should have happened. On a wraith level, it is the scene obviously one that mirrors the more Western origins and purpose of Charon and his ferryman, the latter still working towards their goals and Charon fucking off somewhere. many a lost soul looking for safety, but bound to a land that is not entirely theirs. It's a morbid mirror, to say the least. On the topic of artwork, it's a difficult thing to approach. To say I love the pieces in here does make one sound a little tasteless, but it is not that I don't admire the pieces for their beauty, but more the accuracy. There isn't a pleasant scene here, which is to be expected. Everywhere you look, there are gruesome depictions of life in the camps and ghettos of Europe under Nazi control, and the horrors they endured. Then there's the fact that this is a Wraith book, so practically every Jewish person is more sickly, frail and gaunt than their mortal appearances, and even that was barely an improvement. There are also the more horrific spectres to depict, grounding the illustrations of the World of Darkness underworld. There is no respite in this book, other than the ones you put on yourself. It is honestly incredible how majestic the blending of the horrors of the real and fictional the artists achieve in this book. The piece on page 46 is a personal favourite of mine, as that is more a mournful background. It is a solo Wraith with a violin, playing something for the dead, the piles of the skulls serving as their audience. The book begins in a different way that other World of Darkness books do. There is the short story, yes, but it begins with a foreword that serves as a warning and lesson to the readers, and indeed the rest of the world, to prevent history from repeating itself. I shan't explore the texts in any detail, but you should read them and not skim past them. Once you have read those, you are greeted with an introductory chapter that details what the book aims to cover and what you will find inside. From the get-go, it makes it very clear that this is not a gamey book to trivialize the Holocaust and reduce it to just being a game, but to be used as a medium to tell the story of the Shoah, the 12 million souls who were slaughtered, a story that constantly needs to be retold, as stated by the book. From those couple of sentences alone, the book had my respect. To further cement what it follows, stating it very clearly that it was the humans that caused the Holocaust, not the supernaturals. So many forms of media have made vampires use the Nazis as weapons, or Nazis use werewolves and so forth. It would have been a very White Wolf thing indeed to do something like that, which they technically do with the Get Ephemeris, which we will touch upon in this review, but it speaks volumes on the steps White Wolf were prepared to go to better their previous cultural representation fuck-ups. To quote a passage from Jeff Wayne's New Generation recording of War of the Worlds, the problem is of course the humans. The chapter highlights why this book exists, to which I refer to previous physical flinching in my opening of the review. Well, times are changing, and people are finding new ways to tell these stories, to educate who otherwise wouldn't be aware or understand snippets of tragedy, such as comic books teasing at things, and Mouse by Art Spiegelman changing what can be presented and what can't be presented in comics. The authors here clearly feel it is their place, their duty rather, to do their part so this sort of atrocity doesn't happen again. The book has 5 chapters, with the first one serving as a timeline of the Second World War and what happened, with some World of Darkness related themes mostly in black boxes, labelled clearly so the reader knows the boundaries between fiction and fact lie, which I feel was a very good choice. It's important to distinguish the supernatural influences of the World of Darkness from historical reality. The splats did not cause the Shoah, they only profited from it. The remaining 4 chapters focus on ghettos and concentration camps occupied by the Dibuks, the term the deceased Jewish race used to describe themselves. The book explains that this is an actual term. A Dibuk is a malicious possessing spirit believed to be the disassociated soul of a dead person. It supposedly leaves the host body once it has accomplished its goals, sometimes after being exorcised, which is rather fitting given the general existence of wraiths in World of Darkness media. It also addresses how some are not happy with this title within the World of Darkness, but many have taken it and made it their own. But that is much later in the book. Let us start at the beginning. As stated a moment ago, the first chapter is our timeline, again stating the number of souls murdered. 12 million. 12 million people under the evil Nazi party, not just Jews either, which this book highlights. The Poles, Russians, Roma, communists, socialists, homosexuals, and those with disabilities. That last one I see people forget about a lot, which is an unfortunate truth on the world still to this day. The disabled were the first to be picked off by the Nazis, as were anyone they deemed of no use to their barbaric motives. You probably find that I'm repeating myself a little bit by now, as we are roughly at the 10-minute mark at the review, but I'm honestly pleased with that, in the sense that the chapter does not take its foot off the pedal with its stats and statistics, providing a very thorough review of the rise of the Nazi Party and what they did and the lives they made a living hell. It doesn't sugarcoat it either, for you are told very, very clearly what the Nazis did. The latter events, for lack of a better phrase, is truly stomach-churning, and the early influences of the Nazis is just as frightening from a far more mundane perspective. How they began not with the atrocities, but with the spreading of lies and rumours, ostracizing communities and people from each other, segregating and forcing them to live in forced, squalid accommodations, which is a fucking huge stretch of the word, I have to say. Ghettos, shacks, and whatever they were told to exist in. Of course, we were also told about the various supernatural splats react and interact with the political upheavals and machinations. Mages saw this as a time to up their research. The Gangrel and Ravnos vampires were swept up and experimented upon, as were some of the werewolves. It does mention the Get, as I spoke of earlier. It makes it very clear that it was never the entire tribe that followed the Nazi regime, but a minority of the tribe believing the salvation of Gaia would come through the annihilation of the Weaver, which I suppose is partly true, but the Nazis as the vehicle of inspiration? That's definitely a choice. Of course, this being a minority doesn't matter. The damage and the reputation of the tribe has forever been ruined, as both in the meta plot and outside of it. As for the Wraiths, they were aware of the echoes of the Second World War, to paraphrase the book, but Charon and his Death Lords were focused on their conflict with Yu Huan, the Emperor of the Dark Kingdom of Jade, which leads me how exactly the Death Lords handled this influx of the deceased. To sum up as briefly as I can, Charon was too busy being the racist megalomaniac, focused on defeating the Emperor of the Dark Kingdom of Jade, and once again assigned the serious duty to the squabbling of the Death Lords to sort out. They would hear from said Wraith what was going on and how they would have died. Charon and Death Lord stunned into silence, but not for the reasons you would have hoped for. They were more concerned about the damage their demises would bring to the shroud and influx of spectres and nihils that would tear. The Death Lords and most of the powerful Anacreons would agree without any of the Holocaust Wraiths present were given their own ghettos and necropoli to occupy. They would be protected by the Death Lords and Anacreons in return for their assistance. This would be known as the Partition Accords. This all sounds a little familiar, doesn't it? It's despicable really, but admittedly the shitty things the Death Lords would do. It would please me dearly, and probably the dear listeners here, when I tell you that literally everyone in the underworld was pissed off at this. Many partitioning communities fucked off to live their own lives. Stygian Wraiths would riot against the Death Lords for this special treatment, and most importantly, a group of renegades called the Army of Fire came and rescued those that couldn't save and look after them, allowing them to join and search for their brethren in the Shadowlands. Following the Fifth Great Maelstrom, Charon's disappearance and sacrifice, the Death Lords would call upon the highest authorities beneath them to work out how to deal with these Nazi and Holocaust survivors. The ferrymen would arrive too, and everyone else beneath them called out for neglecting the Holocaust survivors and how their actions fed into Oblivion and ultimately made things worse. As the Death Lords would grant the Holocaust Wraiths land amongst the ghettos of the Skinlands as theirs, and do what they must to do to come to terms with their own deaths, reunite families, and so forth. An event known as the Convent of Millions. It is a fucking huge deal in Wraith lore, as this was the first time since Stygia discovered the other Dark Kingdoms where Stygia would acknowledge an existence or community of Wraiths outside of their control, the largest of these being the Wraiths that are almost bound to Auschwitz, the Dark Kingdom of Wire, the Dark Kingdom within a Dark Kingdom. And that is not even my favourite part. It is canon that these Holocaust Wraiths may hunt Nazi Wraiths without interference from anyone and do whatever they want with them, and that includes the Death Lords themselves, so put that in your fucking pipe and smoke that, you disgusting fascists. The remainder of the chapter focuses on the aftermath of World War II and the Convent of Millions, all presented from a Stygian point of view, mainly with the if, buts and maybes as no one's entirely too sure. Mechanically, this is for the benefit of a storyteller to do what they please, albeit respectfully. The remaining 4 chapters focus on 4 different ghettos. The structures of these follow a similar fashion to that of the first chapter. The historical and factually correct are presented, which serves as morbid world building if you're wanting to have your Wraith characters pass on through or visit these areas. This is, after all, a sourcebook for Wraith the Oblivion, so there has to be some mechanics and tools for storytellers to use if they so wish. Then, the fictional Wraith-specific themes are included, how the world of darkness debukes occupy it, and how they deal with the threats and denizens of the underworld, as spectres and nihils are everywhere to reflect the twisted evil that bleed into the Shadowlands. The wires of Auschwitz that kept the concentration camp survivors in instantly kills Wraiths who touch them, the hatred that encased them in being so strong. At the end of each chapter, you have some NPCs for storytellers to use, all of which are morally great individuals, which is something I actually appreciate. It could have been very easy to paint these characters as all good guys and saints because they are Jewish, for a bit of virtue signaling, but these were people in life that had their own agendas. Some of them were inherently bad people and did things to reflect that, which is not me saying they deserve to die, and especially not the way that they did. Absolutely fucking not. But again, these were trying times and people fought and killed for literal crumbs of food and shelter. The morals are grey in such circumstances, and that trauma changes you, and in the case of Wraith the Oblivion, that is all carried over into the underworld. One of these characters is found in the Auschwitz chapter, a character whose name I'm not going to pronounce because it's incredibly German and I have a German partner and they will bully me if I get the pronunciation a little bit wrong, playfully of course. But anyway, they were a Nazi guard who was only following orders, to quote the book, a mindless lackey. The Wraiths there melted his corpus and reshaped it to resemble a pig. Now, in most circumstances this is totally immoral behaviour from both sides, and the Nazi guard totally deserved it because fuck Nazis, but there is no clear distinction between black and white, just various shades of grey. In addition to these characters, you have a map of the ghetto with landmarks, for lack of a better phrase, labelled, making a useful prop for everyone at the table, as well as story hooks to include the aforementioned characters in stories in these camps. So what about the rest of the chapters? Well, it gets a little difficult to review them as Auschwitz has the biggest write-up for obvious reasons, with the most mechanics to work with, which are still rather sparse, the reasons for which are also fucking obvious, I feel. I don't think it is right for me to go over each one in detail, as the internet is free, and as someone that is not Jewish, I do not think it is wholly my place to properly comment on how each one of the fiction and game systems gels with the facts. That said, an overview of each chapter is needed, I feel. Chapter 2, An Antechamber of the Damned, the Ferenstadt Ghetto, which I probably pronounced wrong, so if I have done, apologies. In 1941, Ferenstadt was a collection point and holding facility of the Polish Jews before they were shipped off to concentration camps. At one point, the Nazis used it as a propaganda to show the International Red Cross how well they were treating the Jewish people. The truth eventually came to light, but not in time for the 87,000 shipped off to death camps from there, or the 33,000 who died within the ghetto walls. Chapter 3, Behind the Wall, the Ghetto at Warsaw. The Warsaw Ghetto was there when the Jewish population of Warsaw, over 1/10 of the city's population, were walled in to separate them from the rest of the world. All 500,000 Jews were forced by the invading Germans to live in an area only 100 blocks in the area, with the 27,000 apartments. Eventually, they began to ship them off to labour camps, but several ghetto residents found out what was actually going on and formed the resistance movement. For 27 days, they managed to hold off the Nazi forces, but eventually were grounded down. Survivors were shipped off and the ghetto was razed. Even in death, the books of the Warsaw remain behind the wall, in a place that reflects the despair and hope of the ghetto's living counterpart. Chapter 4, A Struggle for the Forsaken, Babi Yar. When Ukraine fell to Germany, the Nazis began rounding up the Jewish people of the country and executing them. Babi Yar is the first of many of the sites where mass murders took place. 33,000 Jews were shot and buried in a mass grave in around 36 hours. The books of Babi Yar guard what is left of the settlement from the nearby Nihil. It serves as a gathering place for the other Russian Jews who were executed in a similar fashion. Finally, Chapter 5, Behind the Wire, Auschwitz, the most notorious of the Nazi death camps. Auschwitz is where over 1 million men and women and children from a number of undesirable backgrounds were gassed and cremated in a space of 5 years. Jews, criminals, communists, the Romas, gypsies, gays, and others were systematically sorted and killed, while what little resources they had were turned over to their murderers. So much agonizing death in so little a space has created one of the most turbulent and dark places in the Shadowlands, including the Sheol Nihil that descends straight to Oblivion. Nonetheless, wraiths that still dwell in Auschwitz, but in an atmosphere that is almost as full of anguish as they want left. This book is one of the best books I've ever read, and I am not limiting myself to just World of Darkness, by the way. I literally do mean ever. The preservation of history and educating it has always been incredibly important to me, which might be apparent with the existence of this YouTube channel and podcast. Charnel Houses of Europe, the Shoah, presents a graphic and frank delivery of the irredeemable evil that was the Second World War, and an archive of the atrocities caused by humans that made up the Nazi Party. The book is thoroughly researched and deals mostly in fact, keeping the fiction well away and influenced by reality, rather than the other way round. It highlights and addresses the negligence of the rest of the world that ostracized the minorities that tortured and killed by the Nazis, that only acted when it was bad enough and sit up and take fucking notice, despite the good the world did to mostly stamp out the Nazis and liberate the Jews, Roma and everyone else held by the Nazis. People still followed their twisted ideologies. It took too long for the world to respond to Hitler's tyranny. As I said, there are many shades of black, white and mostly grey that fueled the Second World War. One should briefly mention that Charnel Houses of Europe, the Shoah, fails dreadfully as a sourcebook purely based on the subject matter. Yes, there are some tools in there to further highlight the evil of the Nazis in a fictional sense, as well as a couple of merits and flaws for characters to have, but I do not see anyone using this in their games of Wraith, even if the characters pass these areas going from one place to the next. However, it is clearly not meant to be that sort of book. Charnel Houses of Europe, the Shoah, is a masterclass, a sheer fucking masterclass on the documentation and retelling of the greatest tragedy that humanity has known. It is a book which tells of the horrors of the Nazi machinery, the weakness of its collaborators, the heroicism of the rebellions, and the simple humanity of millions of victims. I implore you all to read this book right now and share it with your children, friends, and loved ones, and educate them and keep these stories and facts alive. Any authors that pick up this book, just remember the good you can achieve if you hire fucking consultants and sensitivity readers and listen to their input. Maybe you too can achieve some semblance of this greatness. And I was going to do my usual review spiel here, but I don't actually think that's fucking appropriate to be joking about that. You can probably tell I'm a tad heated with that. So, no jokes. Just please, for the love of Christ, go and buy and read this fucking book. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.